Hey everyone, welcome back. This is the third video of our introduction series, and for today, we're going to talk about why talk about politics. So scary. Okay, so Unsu, let me first say that I want this to be really casual and fun, because I think in Singapore, politics is such a scary word. Everyone feels that, hey, don't talk politics, man. Like, it get you in trouble, police is watching you, government's watching you. So, I want to really start on this very light note, and I want us to kind of treat this as a video that we want our viewers to know that there's nothing wrong with talking about politics. Yeah. So let's start the ball rolling. Let me ask you, what would you say is, a experience, like your first experience of politics, or is there a moment in your life that is a political awakening? Yeah.
I don't know about my earliest experience, but more recently, I just feel anytime you are in an organization or room of more than two people, there's going to be politics.
Yep.
Because human beings need to cooperate with each other to do anything, and that involves constant negotiation over needs and wants. So as a married person with children, politics is a everyday phenomenon.
Yeah, I wanted to actually say, you stole my line actually. So what I wanted to say was that, let me put it this way. It's arbitrary, obviously, right? But there can be three types of people out there. There's one that is totally apolitical, or someone who's very afraid of politics. They'll be like, don't talk politics, man. I can't take it. Yeah, and these people, I'm not saying anything bad about them, just to be very clear, right? But I feel like they are trying to get through life with the least amount of trouble, and I understand that. Yeah, but you can't avoid politics, even if you don't want to deal with it on a national or global level. Yeah, but you just mentioned it, family level, or friends, or especially at work, right? Everyone goes through some level of politics. And to me, if I were to try to explain politics to someone, it's basically power. Someone has power in a particular unit, so whether it's like the corporation, it's a family unit, or between two lovers even, right? There is someone wielding some form of power, and we are obviously struggling with that. We need to justify it, or we need to talk about, is it the right use of power? And power comes in many ways, obviously. There's verbal or physical and stuff like that. So anyway, that's the first category of people. Yeah, and then the second category, I would consider people who are somewhat casually interested. Yeah, and they understand to some level that politics is important. Yeah, but again, maybe depending on where they are. So perhaps in Singapore, I would say these people, they don't want to get too deep into it because they're worried there's certain repercussions. Yeah. And then there's a third group that I would say that are very, very political. Everything and everyday life is all about politics. Yeah, and I don't worry about these people. Like, I'm very sure they'll find maybe our content a little bit too tame. But to me, what I'm hoping that we can do when we do, what I'm hoping that we do in this video is we try to engage with the first two groups. Yeah, we want to kind of get them thinking a little bit that talking about politics is important. Yeah, and it really does affect your life, and most people can contribute or can do something politically to add value or to pursue some better means in their life, or better ends, I should say, in their life. Yeah. So why not we do it this way? Tell me like what's a really good topic that's you're very engaged with, like something that really comes close to your heart, politically speaking.
Right now, probably the climate emergency is one of the most important topics for me right now. And politics is important with regards to climate change, because in order to come up with solutions for that, we're all going to have to make some big decisions collectively as to what roles we all play, what sacrifices we're all willing to make, what changes we need to make in our laws and our economies. So it's impossible to tackle the climate crisis without politics.
Have you spoken to people who, like I mentioned just now, some people who are not politically interested or want to get really away from politics? Have you ever tried talking to them about climate change, and have you tried to engage with them? Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences?
I think it's hard. I really choose carefully who I discuss climate change with, because it's not something that everyone wants to think about. But I have occasionally, like if I'm in a taxi, I'll just ask the taxi driver what he thinks about global warming and whether he's concerned about it. And it's always, I think, a challenge to get people to think beyond their specific life, right? I mean, something like climate change affects everyone, but most of us we're in our little tunnel with, and yeah, it's a challenge to get people to think beyond that.
Yeah, so let me try to answer that actually. I think the reason why it's challenging is that I think on some intuitive level, people understand that politics is constantly happening around, but it's just not something I can participate in. So I think that is an issue, especially for people in Singapore, because there are very limited political avenues or channels or activities that you can organize and you can participate in, and that really explains the cynicism and the lack of faith that one can make meaningful political change. So earlier just now I asked you about some kind of political awakening. So I'm going to answer it. So I'm actually trying to use this as an example for our viewers. When I went to Australia to study, it was a political awakening for me. Yeah. So I was in Melbourne, Australia, and when I was studying my humanities degree, even though I didn't do anything politically, but I could see like protests. At that time, George Bush was the US president, John Howard was the Australian president, and both of them are conservatives. And there was a lot of uproar, there was a lot of resistance to the Iraq occupation. Yeah, and I was very, my mind was blown literally, not literally, my mind was blown away by seeing how people were getting together and they were having, like you said, a collective voice, right? And I guess the most important thing I want people to know is that there was no chaos, there was no the economy broke down, or there was anarchy in the streets. People can have very reasonable political outings or activities, and it doesn't lead to a breakdown of society. Yeah, and that basically dispelled and broke the spell, right, in terms of my conventional thoughts about politics. Yeah, and I think that's what people lack. Obviously there are a lot of people who travel, they go to another country, they see different cultures and different lifestyle habits, different practices, but they may not get a sense of the political culture. Yeah, and it's really enlightening. If you can't visit that country, well, at least you can read about it, or you can see for yourself that in another country, people can actually do amazing things politically, and it has led to better outcomes for the people there. Yeah, so that's what I feel, that's what people lack. They lack exposure, essentially. Yeah, and they lack, not say lack, maybe that's not the right word, but certainly they don't have that faith that, hey, it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing if we are more vocal politically. So yeah, that's what I feel. What do you think?
I would like to add to what you've already been saying, and which is about the connection between politics and power. I totally agree with that, and I think one reason why people shy away from politics is because they're uncomfortable talking about power. I mean, even within a family, for instance, how often do you have a family of a father and mother and kids and talking about, oh, who has power here? And, you know, you just don't do that. It's something we feel very awkward about. And what I would like to promote is this idea that there's nothing mysterious or weird about power. I mean, we need power in our everyday lives, like just to get things done. So, for example, let's say I wanted to rearrange our set and move some furniture around, you know, move a sofa in, and I can't do that by myself. So I'll have to convince you to help me, and I have to convince you that that is something worthwhile doing. And then even when you agree, we need to agree like who's going to pick up which end of the sofa, who's going to walk first. So, you know, that's just a common everyday example of how like you know, power is just something that it's a daily fact of life, and it's just better if we talk about it. Because if we don't, then there's a risk that we'll just do things very inefficiently or even work towards the wrong goal. So that's just a simple example of a sofa, but you know, when we talk about big societal issues, that just becomes so much more complex.
Yeah, my introductory book to politics is actually the book by Noam Chomsky called Understanding Power. Yeah, and I can tell you, man, like when I picked up that book, it was so random. It was just in this bookstore in Melbourne, and I didn't even know who he was. Like I just saw his face, I saw this book is on sale, and I was like, okay, I'll pick up this book, I'll read it and see what it's all about. And I remember at that time, I stayed alone, and I was like spending nights literally not trying to read the stuff that I'm assigned to read for school, but actually reading his book. And I gained so much from it because now obviously, just to let the viewers know, you know, it helps to have knowledge about US politics because obviously he concentrates on that. And I'm not suggesting that you have to read the book is quite old by now. But it's more like to understand, like what you said, that power is it's a intractable, you know, dimension and element in our life. Like we have to deal with it one way or another. Yeah, and it doesn't mean that, you know, one has to use it in an unjust manner. One can use power in a just way, an equitable way. Or another way to look at it is that we can learn how to distribute power more equally, you know, among stakeholders, among involved parties. And what more when we talk about a country, right? So, you know, we, the citizens, obviously should feel empowered to be vocal and to, you know, express our desires for where we want our country to go. And especially as you mentioned in this climate emergency, I think it's a lot more imperative on us, right, to do the hard work, to do the research, read up a little bit about what's happening in the state of the world, and also, you know, do our part to try to make it a better place. So literally, politics is about trying to make the world a better place.
So I want to try something. I want to just say some phrases or quotes, and I just want you to respond to it.
Yeah.
Like, you know, so the first one is, if you trust the people, they will become trustworthy.
Wow. Don't tell me who said it, because I'm trying to respond to this as impartial as I can. If you trust the people, they can, say again? If you
they will become trustworthy.
They will become trustworthy. So this sounds like a saying that is coming from a politician. Yeah, and I have, at least right now, my gut feel is to support it. Yeah, to say that, yeah, politicians or state leaders should trust the people. Yeah, and I think that's maybe a primary first step. But I'm going to be a little bit, let's say I would play devil's advocate a little bit here. Sometimes, even in a democracy, and we want to define these terms very precisely. I won't do that right now, but let's try it later or in another video. The idea is that the people's opinion is right. Yeah, and that's not necessarily the case. You know, it's not necessarily the case that the majority of people have the right, well, at least to me, right? Obviously, this is a subjective take, but they may not have the right set of values. But I think as a first principle, in terms of the political structure, in terms of the institutions and how they should function, that should be, as a first principle, they should trust the people to some degree. Yeah. Okay, how did I go with that? I mean,
I'm not going to evaluate your response. I was just curious what your response would be. So here's my second statement, and it's almost the flip side of the first.
Yeah.
People get the government they deserve.
Okay, I like that one. I like that one because I think it's a certain truism about it. I think there obviously is a flip side to that flip side. Okay, what I mean by that is that there are governments that are oppressive. There are governments that are incredibly brutal and fascist, right? Authoritarian. And can we blame the people? Sometimes not, because maybe those people have very little power. So to me, if someone were to say, would I take that statement and apply it to North Korea and the people there, that's hard. That's a hard stretch for me. I wouldn't necessarily say that North Koreans deserve the government they got. On the other hand, when you have a society that is relatively free, where the people are able to, there's some degree of independence and autonomy for them to research, for them to find out more about what the government is up to even potentially protest or to at least counter against the government's narratives, then that statement becomes a little bit more true to application. Like, yeah, you can kind of say the people there do kind of get the government that they deserve. So that's my nuanced take. Yeah, and I hope that at least shows to the viewers that, yeah, I don't just try to respond in a blanket fashion. I think there are a lot of nuances that people have to take into account, with statements like that. Yeah. What do you think of this? Why did you come up with this thought challenge? Yeah, that's interesting. Did you try it with other people?
No. I was actually inspired by this other podcast by this guy Yancey Strickler, and he ended the podcast with like what's quick fire round, and he would just say like 5 different things and get the guests to respond. I don't have any fixed views on this question like yourself. I think it's a very nuanced subject. Yeah. Like, and I'm hoping to be able to explore like some of these statements in depth as in the show. So.
Yeah, I actually want to say that's not a bad suggestion. I actually think what we can do is take a statement like what you just mentioned, like say people get the government they deserve, and do like a 15-20 minute take on that statement alone. Yeah, because it can be subjected to philosophical scrutiny. Yeah. On that note, right, on that particular statement, and I want to relate this to Singaporeans out there, right, that is the kind of statement I see coming from the pro-opposition side to say that, hey, if you're unhappy with a policy that the government has decided to implement, blame it on yourself because you voted in this government. And it's a knee-jerk reaction, I get it, and look, trust me, sometimes I feel it too. I want to say that too, like, don't complain, but I have to admit that, and this is why we need to do this video. This is why I think this is such an important mission for everyone, but at least for me personally. Yeah, we don't want to sink into that cynicism and like, well, you deserve it, so I'm not going to do anything about it. Yeah, and boo-hoo, haha, like that's just a sad way to get through life. Yeah, and it's also not constructive as a citizen, right? So that's the other thing about politics, which is in Singapore, right, it's sometimes being described as a consumerist society, right? We got the 5 C's, right? And essentially, I don't even have to say what the 5 C's are. Everyone understands it. Credit card, condo. You can see I'm not a 5C chaser because I just ran out of like what the other 3 are.
Credit card. I don't know.
Cash, I believe, and okay.
Camera guy, feel free to.
Yeah, camera guy. Yeah. Country club.
Right.
Yeah.
Condo.
Yeah, condo. Yeah, you can see for someone like me, like I probably only just got 1 cash. Okay, so anyway, yeah, and that's the thing, right? Sorry, just to bring this back to our viewers. What do we want to be? Do we want to be consumers or do we want to be citizens, right? And I don't want to be a consumer. I don't think that's the way to get through life. Yeah, And there's no virtue to being a better consumer. So what if you got the 5 C's? Are you a better person? Yeah, no, I'm sorry, not in my view. And I certainly even think that people who have met these 5 goals, and there's nothing wrong if you manage to obtain these 5, luxury, wants or desires. But it shouldn't just stop there, like in terms of what you want to be as a human being, and in terms of how you want to, do good for your fellow man. And that's the other thing about being politically involved. You want to be a better citizen, and philosophers obviously have talked a lot about what makes a good citizen. Yeah, what is good citizenry, or what is a good government as well. The idea is that I want us all to be better citizens.
So yeah, I know we like to bring in pop culture in our discussions. So I was just thinking of Game of Thrones.
Yes.
And their vision of politics is really cutthroat and bleak. They have different images. Like, I think Daenerys at one point talked about this big wheel that just grinds.
Yes.
Like just kings and warriors and whatever, in this endless cycle of vengeance. And then another character would describe it as just this ladder that you have to keep climbing up, right? And I think a lot of people, why Game of Thrones resonated is that a lot of people look at the world and they actually see that the world is like that. Like, politics does seem very cynical and bleak. And I would like to try and figure out a vision of politics that is more optimistic and hopeful. And so how I look at politics is that it should be like a scientific experiment where the problem wasn't solved 200 years ago with the French and American revolutions. Like, it should be an ongoing project. We should have 1,000 different experiments in democracy and use evidence to figure out which ones produce better outcomes. And so to me, that's exciting.
That's also what gets me excited about politics as well. So just to add on to what you're saying, let's talk about, let's run through like a few things that you and I are probably aware of. For example, some cities or some countries are experimenting with universal basic income, right? In Singapore, we have discussions, very rigorous debates about minimum wage versus the government's model of what they call a progressive wage model. There are also experiments right now on like the global wealth tax, and there's also stuff to do with democratic workspaces, so where workers have more say and more meaningful participation in their work places. So there are all these things happening, right? And it goes back to what I said earlier about like how I think that a lot of people are not exposed to such things. And I think if they were, and I would like to imagine if they knew that, hey, another country is trying this, why can't we do it, And, just to bring it down also to some of our viewers, like even something as simple as paternity leave, like just as a quick note, I used to work in the government, and at the time, that's about 15 years ago, there was no paternity leave. And, there was actually a lot of work behind the scenes to get paternity leave legislated and, made viable, and actually for us in Singapore to actually have it. But if you just think back 20 years ago, we didn't even have that at all. So, so even when we take big issues like climate change, and I understand some people would feel like, I'm not an environmentalist, I don't know anything about climate change, I don't feel like I got anything to say. And hence, like I said, they try to draw away from politics overall. I mean, that's a bad move because, hey, what about, having more welfare benefits for families? What about, think about having better pay? Everyone wants to have better pay. I mean, that's politics. You got to get involved, you got to dig in. And the thing with politics is that, short of using violence, right, the only other way to get around it is really to petition, to vocalize, and to join with other people for a cause, right? So it can be something as simple as minimum wage. We want better wages for, the poorest of society, and by being involved, it really shows, or it sends a signal to the to the higher ups, to the powers that be, that hey, this is what we want as a society. So basically my message is people shouldn't feel like as if they're too small. Yeah, everyone has a part to play. So we usually end our introduction videos with an idea about what people who are new to this should try to do. And with politics, it's very difficult. I don't actually need people to read more political books. What do you think?
Yeah, for me, politics begins with just who's around you. Like I don't like where people start by pointing fingers at someone that is so far removed from them, and it limits your sense of agency. I think the most important thing is to recover a sense of agency, and that means just starting with people around you and figure out what problems can you collectively solve with these people that you have direct access to.
Yeah, so so I'm actually going to take back what I just said actually. Because I said that I don't necessarily feel that it's good for them to start with political literature, and I have to break that down a little bit. I think people should read more in general, so I just want to exemplify this with a real personal example. So I have a friend, he's a very dear friend of mine. He's my, from primary school to now, very close friend of many years. And he's someone who works, a very laborious type of job. And he was one day having dinner with me. We usually take 1 year to catch up. And I just want to make this quick. And he basically says to me, I didn't know there's things like Bitcoin. I didn't know about GameStop. I didn't know about, the things that are happening with climate change, stuff like that. Like he was totally blown away when he talked to a friend of his, and he didn't understand that these issues were, happening all around him. So I think to some degree, people just need to be kept abreast about political events. So to some degree, they should at least read a little bit. So I will actually say that, yeah, a little bit of reading will go a long way. And the advice I gave my friend actually was that, he can start small. Literally just read the headlines at least. Yeah, read the headlines of the news, get a little bit of a sense of like, hey, what's going on in the world? Yeah. And then the other thing that I'd like to see whether you agree with me on this is, so I want to shoot you an example. So if you go through Facebook, other social media channels, there are people who say things like Singapore is a communist country, the PAP is a communist party, so there are all these like very loose statements being thrown around, and sometimes I feel really sad because I think they don't even understand the meaning of the word. Yeah, so I think we actually do need to take this concepts. So if someone says communism, capitalism, socialism, right, we need to actually be very precise about what these words mean. Yeah, and I think that kind of education is actually sorely needed. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I would also add that sometimes I'm suspicious of labels because I think applying a label to something can often be an intellectually lazy approach.
Yeah.
You think by putting a label on it, you've understood it and whatever. And I personally don't like to be described by labels. I think life is a verb, it's a process, and we're constantly changing and evolving, and labels have to be updated constantly.
Yeah, actually, this is a good point you brought up. So one thing that I was thinking about is about political identity. So I think it's less in Singapore, but certainly we can see in many other places where someone says, I'm a socialist, I'm a conservative right-winger or something. I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, right? And these identities are sometimes very tightly held onto, right? And my sense is that, according to the social research out there, that people are now finding it harder to distance themselves from a political identity, even compared to a religious identity. So people would, a good example from some research I've read is that years ago, parents would be comfortable if their children married someone of a different political party. But right now, that number has declined. Now, parents are actually more upset or resentful if I'm a Republican, I don't want you to marry a Democrat, as an American example. So, what's your sense of this? Like, do you think this is, inevitable? Do you think this is just where we're going to because people are becoming more politically educated, hence now, there's more premium placed onto what your political identity is or your political ideas are. Do you think that's happening, or and do you think it's, what's your take?
Yeah, I really don't think I can fully answer that right now. All I can say is that political polarization is a phenomena that so many observers and commentators agree on. There's a lot of different suggestions as to how we can reduce that polarization, but what it just comes down to is a breakdown in civil discourse. I think we've forgotten the ability to just have a decent and rich conversation with each other, where we all feel safe to show up as our full selves, and we all have the experience of being listened to empathetically. And I think that's such an important element to bring back into politics.
I've been reading a book that pertains to this topic. So the book is called Conflicted, and I can't remember the subtitle right now, but it's a book written by Ian Leslie. And the reason why he wrote the book is that he's trying to show that we can have productive disagreements and still try to be good people to each other. So maybe a review one day. But I'm going to answer what I just asked you. And actually, to me, right, I guess my sense of this is that people shouldn't feel like as if they need to attach themselves to a political identity, because politics is very different from, say, religion. Like some people would always be a Christian, a Hindu, or a Muslim, but politics is a different domain where things can change, and things obviously do change all the time. Maybe one day I may be more socialistic in terms of approaching a certain policy, but maybe with another thing, I may not be that way. I might be considered more conservative or more right-wing thinking. And I think these issues are very multifaceted and complex. So my sense is that don't have to feel like you got to define yourself with a certain political label, because life is just too complicated, and the issues that we face, sometimes it does require a different approach, and there's always this struggle between individual freedom and the society's welfare, or the values that a particular society wants to uphold. And that struggle is always going to be there. That tension is always there. Sometimes I'm going to go this way, sometimes I'm going to go that way, and it all depends on the context. So what do you want to say to our viewers in concluding this video? What do you think is important for them to hear about politics, or how they should approach it?
I think that more than ever, now is the time for people to be interested and engaged in politics, because the stakes are high. The challenges confronting humanity are immense. And politics is a vehicle through which we can evolve our consciousness, hopefully.
Yeah, for me, what I would say is that in line with what you just said, and not to repeat the same points, is that there's the famous quote, right, which is, you may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. We will dig up the source of that quote in our video, in our caption. But what I want to add on to that is that I think you can't help it. You got to, even by being passive, you are participating. Yeah, it's a paradox, but yeah, by being passive, you are letting other people do stuff politically, and that stuff will affect you one way or another. Yeah, and to relate this back to the Singapore context, you're right. There was a time where people could be aloof about it, like, don't bother me about politics. Yeah, and obviously there were very good reasons why back then it was extremely difficult, extremely risky to get involved in politics. But I think that window of opportunity is opening up. I think, and I'm especially inspired by the youth of Singapore, who are obviously taking much more direct measures. And let's be frank, the youth can take that risk. People like us sometimes can't take that kind of risk, because we cannot afford to have, very heavy repercussions, if we were to be more involved politically. But the idea here is that with every successful generation, I think we want to build towards a bigger window of political freedom. And yes, some boundaries will be pushed. There'll be some discomfort, especially among older people, perhaps, because they may think that everything is fine and dandy, and it's better to have a society where it's consensus, where there's a certain consensus or the majority makes a consensus. But that's probably a veneer. That's probably not real. There's probably a lot more going on underground. And now that these voices are rising up to the top, or rising up so that they can be heard, I think we should be happy about it, honestly. I think we should be glad that we're leaning towards a much more participative society, and all the better for every one of us. Yeah, and it doesn't matter if you disagree with even the more vocal voices of the other camp. So even though you and I have our own political biases, but even I'll be happy for other people to be able to speak up, as long as we are able to speak up as well.
So I agree with almost everything you said, but I do disagree that the youth have a greater ability to take risks than we do. I mean, a very simple way to look at it is youth have their whole lives in front of them. So in some ways, they have more to lose if there are repercussions for their political activity. But the more general point I want to make is that I think politics is something that we all have to take collective responsibility for. And we all bring different roles, different things. And so one way I like to look at it, which I borrowed from this other guy, Parker Palmer, is the youth have a longer horizon, right? Because they can see further. Like in some ways, they have to think about consequences of, let's say, climate change that we don't have to think about. But older people have perspective and have experience. So in some ways, we are standing on the shoulders of the youth. Like by standing on them, we can hopefully look towards a further horizon. And I also don't think it's fair to put all the responsibility. Well, that's not what you said, but I think other people,
spare me from the comments. It's going to come from you.
You didn't say that. But other people there's this general sense of like the future depends on the youth, right? I mean, that's sort of out there. And I actually disagree with that. It's too much responsibility to put on their shoulders. We have to play our part as well.
Yeah, so before I get hammered and trolled and so first thing, I'm not a boomer. I'm actually considered the very tail end of a millennial. So in any case, no, thanks for saying all that, and it gives me a chance to really expound on what I meant. Of course, I do not mean that all the responsibility should be, burden on the youth. The statement that I made about how they have more degrees of risk-taking freedom is really something that I do actually quote from Noam Chomsky on this one, because I think what he's just trying to describe is kind of a universal trend in human society, in modern society, where even our parents' generation, or maybe the parents even before that, when they were young, they probably took risks too. Yeah, and they may have had their own idiosyncratic ways of resisting against the conventions of their time, but essentially you always see the youth of that particular generation taking on that risk. And I think it's really to kind of go along with what you just said. I think it's because they have a far-reaching vision, obviously. As people get older, I mean, it's not universal, obviously it doesn't apply to everyone, but as people get older, generally you feel like you got wisdom, you feel that, hey, this is the way things have been running for so long, no problem for me, why is it a problem for you, right? So that's me kind of putting it in a very casual kind of manner.